As I got another rhyme, another rhythm for y'all to listen. I'm never quitting on my mission. I'ma roll with what I'm giving. Got some ambition, this new edition, filling positions. Looking at the void in myself and feeling what's missing. Better watch the way you going, better go in the right direction. In the moment you stressing, but you gon' be counting blessings. And I know that for certain. Keep on working, open curtains, haters swerving, cause they ain't ready for your final version. Whoa. I'm never gonna give up, fall down, I just gotta get up, yeah. Cause this is my road. Let's camera action.
You're listening to the Tom Ficklin Show on WNHHLP 103.5 FM, your home for community radio.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the Tom Ficklin Show. My name is Georgia Goldburn. I am the Executive Director of Hope for New Haven, which is a faith-based nonprofit located in the Worcester Square neighborhood. I am also the co-founder of Circle, which is a network of providers that are serving primarily children of color or who themselves are providers of color. Our network is inclusive of about 38 businesses that are located in the greater New Haven and Fairfield area. We support 200 educators, early care educators, and we also support over 900 children. So I would like to take the opportunity once again to thank Tom Ficklin for this platform to discuss the topic of the childcare crisis and just talk about what the crisis is and basically to work on solutions. So I am so thrilled to be joined here today by Pierre Joseph, and I'm just going to embarrass him a bit by reading his bio. So Pierre joined the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston as the Inclusive Economies Manager to support cross-unit inclusive economies efforts of the Regional and Community Outreach Department. Inclusive economies aim to develop strategic effort that will shift the drivers of inequity so that all may benefit from economic growth and recovery with a focus on lower income, smaller cities and rural communities. Prior to joining the Boston Fed, Pierre spent a decade in various roles across philanthropy, impact investing, and government. As a grant maker, Pierre supported integrated capital approaches, democratizing finances for small businesses. In government, he served as a policy analyst in the Department of Health and Human Services and the White House Rural Council. Pierre is a Harry S. Truman Scholar and holds a BA in Political Science with a concentration in Urban Policy from Amherst College. So welcome, Pierre. Thank you for joining us.
I'm happy to be here, Georgia. Thank you for having me.
Okay, so I want to give you an opportunity just to kind of say the capacity in which you're joining us or speak to the capacity in which you're joining us today.
Yeah, so I first of all just have to give a quick disclaimer. My views are my own and don't necessarily represent the Federal Reserve System nor the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston. I'm really here in my capacity as a practitioner who has engaged in the work of trying to build inclusive economies, and I'm really here to speak to my vantage point. As someone who's largely been a creature of government, I've worked for 2 US senators, spent some time in DC, like you mentioned, Georgia, and I've had, I think, both the awesome privilege and opportunity to work within philanthropy and the impact investing space as a grant maker in supporting groups across this country that are really trying to do the work of building an economy that works for all. That's why I'm here, and I'm hopeful that I can share a perspective that is helpful for listeners that are also trying to engage in this collective work of building an economy that works for all.
So, Pierre, I will share with you that I've had an opportunity to have 2 conversations previous to our conversation, and we've basically just broken down at a very high level the crisis, and the crisis more specifically in Connecticut in childcare. And when I was considering this conversation today, I was just like, how do we connect people with inclusive economies and childcare? How does that intersect? So before we kind of delve into that, can you just talk to people, give a more in-depth understanding of what inclusive economies are and how we build them?
Right on. So I think at a high level for me, there's really three pillars to inclusive economy. I think the goal of an inclusive economy is an inclusive economy that works for all. But what does that really mean? There's three pillars. I think the first is an understanding of credit and capital.
Mhm.
Credit and capital being like the necessary tool, monies and resources in order to launch a business, in order to hire workers and pay them fair wages, in order to like do the things that like individuals often can't do on their own. Like you need new forms of capital, which means relationships with banks. It means relationships with potential investors that want to offer friendly terms to folks that have been historically denied opportunities to investment. And I think like the credit and capital pieces is a critical foundation to like two other points. The other
Mhm.
way that I think about building an inclusive economy is wages and wealth.
Mm.
Income is obviously important. It's the thing that allows you to get by, but wealth allows you to get ahead, and it also allows you to weather shocks, which we know inevitably happen from time to time. And having even a baseline level of wealth allows you to be able to weather economic downturns. And like most folks haven't had access to a safety net that wealth provides. And then I think the third pillar in building an inclusive economy is what I call community driven economic development. And for me, like this is critical because economic development can't just be opportunities to attract big box businesses into smaller communities that have been denied investment opportunities. Community driven economic development puts a premise on lived experience coming from community members that are working together in order to advance a collective goal. And there's a range of opportunities and ways in which communities are showing up and trying to advance more inclusive economic development models. It looks like folks that are thinking through supporting local food businesses and entrepreneurs that are connecting those businesses to potential supply chains within their local communities. It looks like folks like you, Georgia, and folks within Circle that are advancing models and strategies to expand access to childcare and also create opportunities for wealth building for providers. It looks like bringing different stakeholders together who oftentimes aren't talking to each other and bring them into a conversation around what is it that we prioritize as a community and how do we then start thinking through how we invest resources differently to achieve those goals and objectives. And
You know,
that for me is how I think about an inclusive economy at a higher level.
it's interesting. You made so many points that I just want to like bite on, but I'm gonna take the last piece, and that is about what we prioritize. Because I had to think about Circle, and we're constantly having to do our elevator pitch to different constituents and different stakeholders about Circle. And some of the policies that I see that Connecticut is approaching, and even at the federal level that we are pursuing, I just couldn't understand why some of these policies didn't sit right with me and why I was feeling like, well, if we achieve that, will we truly achieve equity or an inclusive economy? And as I'm thinking about what type of legislation is needed in this time as we're looking to solve the childcare crisis, one of the things that I stumbled on in just trying to understand our work is that Circle really started to address a child outcome issue. And we came about and we looked at ways that we can address where Black and Brown children live and learn as a result of the research by Dr. Gilliam about out of school suspension, a disproportionate out of school suspension of Black and Brown children. And it occurred to me a part of the reason why I am not as comfortable with some of the policies. And what I mean specifically is the policy around creating access and driving down costs for care. And on the surface, it seems like, oh, that's a good thing. If we give more families greater access to care and education and we drive down the cost of care, it will solve the problem. But again, for me, I thought about the K-12 system and I'm just like, well, all of our Black and Brown children have access to K-12 education and it's free to them. But the outcome for our Black and Brown children are very different. Connecticut has one of the largest achievement gap in the nation. And so as I was thinking about your work, it just occurred to me that one of the things I have been trying to wrestle with or land in is the inclusive economy model, right? Because we can reduce the cost of care for parents and we can create access. But if people don't have if they're not stakeholders, if they're not the one driving the conversations, if they're not the ones with the leadership, the ownership stake in this work, then we fundamentally will not change the situation for Black and Brown children. And so, Pierre, the model, the thing, the conversation we've been having for the past couple of months have helped me to understand why the work that Circle is attempting to do, while it seemed that aligns with, building an inclusive economy, the approach and the strategy will not achieve that end. So I want you to kind of talk about that. And I know I'm kind of like rambling a bit, and I hope I make sense, but I'm still trying to figure out this work as well. So talk to me about the idea of the ownership stake of community members in this work.
Yeah, so like for me, this work building inclusive economies begins and ends with community stakeholders. And I think what is critical in, I think, advancing the work of Circle, if you want to improve outcomes, it's also building a bigger tent because, like, I think addressing the childcare crisis is important, but it has to be paired with the other types of investments that communities need in order to thrive. And I think the question becomes like, how can Circle and this work around expanding childcare and expanding ownership opportunities for some of these, for some of the folks that you have, some of the childcare workers that you're working with, it's this question of how do we build the bigger support structures and investments that folks need to actually thrive? So, like, yes, we have to expand and increase access to childcare while also expanding ownership opportunities within an economy. And like that can look like pairing home ownership with these childcare businesses. It could look like beginning to think through what are the other types of investments that we want in our community that are not being prioritized alongside investing in childcare in ways that actually transform outcomes for children's and families. And I think that's I think there's an opportunity here to open up the window of possibility for like who is a part of this coalition for Circle and like what are we actually striving for? Like what is the more long-term vision here?
So you talk about the opportunities, right? And I guess the question would be, again, our space is early care and education. And so talk about how those opportunities can actually come about. And you kind of touched on it a little bit, and you talk about home ownership, and that's something I kind of want to delve a little bit more deeply with you. But in addition to parent home ownership with addressing the childcare crisis, what are some other opportunities that you see that can bring about inclusive economies through investing in the early care system, and more specifically in investing in providers of color and communities
Yeah.
of.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think I want to go back in history for a brief moment in time. And like when I think about your question, I think about the work of Ruby Duncan and Operation Hope. If any of you have read Storming Caesar's Palace, this book by Annalise Orlek, a historian, what she does is she traces the growth and the development of this women of color led organization in North Las Vegas that acted as one of the first critical community development corporations within North Nevada. And what they were able to do through the leadership of Ruby Duncan is create the first library within their community, create the first community health center within their community, create the first childcare co-op within their community. And this at its core is like the basic building blocks of community development. And when I think about your work with, and when I fast forward and think about your work with Circle, like it's bringing that thread and that history back to the forefront. That like at our core, I think there's this there's this desire to build community and build community in ways in which folks are able to thrive and realize their full potential. And like, what does that mean in the context of childcare? I think I briefly touched on housing housing and home ownership as an opportunity for providers to realize their dreams and their economic potential. What I also think about in the grander context is as groups are working on by the block strategies, because we know like ownership is critical to building economies. Thinking through mixed use, mixed income developments in which you could have great small businesses on the bottom and then housing opportunities on top, or having a childcare business is one of those businesses that are going to be a part of a development. Thinking through more grand plans of what it means to combine the pillars that local residents think are critical in building their economies, and then beginning to work with banks and philanthropy and impact investors to begin thinking through what is the capital stack necessary in order to achieve this transformation. Because I think what we know is like the status quo isn't good enough if we want to advance outcomes for the folks that really matter.
So, Pierre, I want to kind of challenge you a little bit on this, and I'm just doing that just for effect because
Please
I know
do.
where you stand. So, you can achieve all of those things without actually having a racial lens, right? So, all of the policy prescription that you described, you can actually do that without having a racial lens. Circle has a very specific racial lens because having operated in Connecticut in early care and education for about going on 20 years now, and being an educator prior to that in the K-12 system, right? Connecticut is highly racially segregated in the early care sector. I tell people all the time, I can always tell who the owner and the director is of a program by the racial makeup of the children, right? And this is why Circle, in trying to reach those Black and brown children, target owners of color because we know that that's where they're being served. So a lot of the stuff that you describe, you can actually do that and allow, lots of people from different communities who have really good heart and want to do really good things for communities of color and children of color to come in and to do this work. And so I'm just going to ask you to speak to the importance, if you think there is an importance, of having a racial lens and ensuring that that work is being done primarily by people of color, especially those that are resided in communities of color.
I mean, I think my short answer on this would be like those most in proximity to the pain and those who have been historically disinvested in have to be the ones leading this work. Like when I talk about the importance of this work being community led, like that is at its core, like nothing for us without us. And I think if we're not building in that local governance stake by largely folks of color and folks who have been impacted by systems of disinvestment, then we're actually not achieving a more inclusive economy. We're not achieving the types of outcomes that matter that can fundamentally transform place because you're always going to be leaving someone behind. And I
Mhm.
think for me, as I think about this larger project of building inclusive economies, again, it begins and ends with those community stakeholders who are oftentimes left out of the conversation. And I think, again, when you look across the span of history and how historically in the United States we have conveniently left particular groups out, going back to the New Deal, looking at the Great Society, even as you look at some of the place-based investments of today, like that is the history and the legacy of compounding disadvantage. And unless and until folks begin prioritizing those who've been historically excluded and left out of opportunities to build wealth, left out of opportunities for broader community investment, we're just going to be recreating disadvantage. And that's fundamentally a recipe for disaster.
And this is my coinage, if coinage is even a word, a 40 acre and a mule strategy then. rather than a sharecropping strategy. So it's about ensuring that those people, again, as you said, the folks that are closest to the pain are the ones that are the source. And this is what we've always advocated at Circle, is that those folks are the source of the solution of the problem. And I think a lot of times when I listen to folks, I think, I work with a lot of well-meaning people in Connecticut. And of course, Connecticut is slowly growing a larger minority population here. And I think that there are folks in conversation that I've had with folks that are really well-meaning, that believe that, again, if you just create really great educational opportunity for folks, then it really shouldn't matter about race. And sometimes, people get very comfortable about that racial conversation. But again, when you look at poverty and where poverty is concentrated, you cannot disassociate the racial impact of that. And so for us, we think it's very important to have a racial lens when we're talking about these things. And again, I think you would agree that when we're going into communities of color, that those folks need to be the drivers of the conversation. But so you talked about,
And I would say that also requires like resourcing and funding, like putting my former funder hat on. Like if groups are not resourced in order to show up and do this work, because oftentimes this level of community organizing is the thankless work that everyone loves to applaud, but they don't realize the cost that's required in order to engage and do this work. Unless groups are invested in to do this work for the long haul, we're not going to build, I think, the necessary community social infrastructure that I think is like fundamental to then begin having these conversations around what community investment looks like, having these conversations around how do we distribute resources differently and invest in a new way of being and doing. Like
I'm
that work is critical.
I'm glad that you raised that, because oftentimes what happens is that there are community investments that are wholly insufficient for the scope of the work that needs to be done. And oftentimes people of color find themselves, including Circle, we find ourselves with having these really big ideas that we know can work, but the investment is insufficient to basically manage the scope of the work. And then what invariably happens, and I've heard this in other spaces where I've gathered with folks who are grantees, and you are scraping by to try to build something really great with insufficient resources. And then the output is something that doesn't reflect what we say is quality and what we know to be quality. And then you have the unintended or intended consequence of people looking at people of color driving this work, saying, well, they're not really producing quality, so we can't really invest in them, or we have to be risk averse when we are looking to invest in certain programs or communities of color, because we are, based on past experiences, we have not necessarily seen the outcomes that they have promised. So can you speak to the importance, especially from that philanthropic lens and that social impact investor lens? Can you speak to some of those reticence? Because I can speak as a grantee, but can you speak to that lens as to why the investments don't often follow at the level that it needs to?
Putting my former funder hat on. I mean, I think at a high level, I think it's understanding that the work of social transformation with an equity lens will fundamentally require more than a philanthropic grant. I
Mhm.
think in many ways that our nonprofits, our community organizing groups, they are highly dependent on philanthropic resources in order to do their work. And what is the timeline of a funder? It is 2 years, it is 3 years. If you're lucky, sometimes it's 5, maybe it's 10 if you're a foundation that has a very large endowment. And the the appetite, the the appetite and desire for community change and transformation just fundamentally doesn't, oftentimes cannot meet limited wallets of funders who operate on those time horizons. That said, I think it is important for groups like yourself and other nonprofits to use philanthropic capital in order to demonstrate proof of concept, because that's oftentimes what it is philanthropy is looking to fund. And then we have to start having this larger conversation around like what does it fundamentally mean to invest to achieve transformation, because demonstrations are nice, they are pretty, but to your point, they are wholly insufficient if we want to achieve our objectives. And that's where the conversation needs to open up, and it becomes a question around how can we use public resources differently, how can we begin thinking through again like earned revenue and ownership opportunities for our communities that allow them to access different types of investment beyond grants. There are impact investments that some foundations can't make. There are, and like a lot of that requires business models. It requires organizations beyond 501c3 that I think oftentimes groups have been comfortable in creating because they're used to getting that grant, and a couple of grants allow them to do what they're doing and they think it's great. But in reality, like if transformation is the goal, we need to begin thinking through what is the toolbox of resources that we can leverage in order to achieve that. And that is a very different type of conversation that I've found that most nonprofits, let alone childcare providers, are thinking about.
It's interesting because I'm so glad that you talked about the limitation of grants in doing some of these community transformation, because I think we look so heavily towards grants and to government, and I think definitely philanthropy and government has a role to play.
Yep.
But one of the things that I think can be like a really wonderful opportunity to kind of swing the pendulum back into spaces where people feel a little bit more comfortable that we can have real transformational change is looking at when you talk about investments, different types of investments. So for instance, we talked about home ownership in New Haven, there in Connecticut, and I think across the nation, we know that there's a lack of affordable housing, right? And there are lots of people that also cannot afford, even if they can find housing, they cannot afford to maintain the rent each month. And we have a lack of childcare spaces. And we're looking at ways that we can increase childcare capacity. And oftentimes when I speak to the Economic Development Office in New Haven, they're like, Georgia, I know that this is a crisis, but here's a bigger crisis, home ownership. And where I think I've failed in this conversation, and where I want to increase or expand the conversation and include like organizations like the Federal Reserve, is that we can actually marry these two goals, and it doesn't have to be a either or proposition. So for instance, there are many providers that are in the Circle network that are renting their properties, right? And we struggled in Connecticut. Another organization, All Our Kin, worked for over 5 years to create legislation that will protect family childcare providers who are renting properties to be able to operate their childcare business. And we were not successful, or they were not successful in creating legislation to protect family childcare providers. And so as I'm thinking about this problem, I'm thinking, well, how can we support through investments, right? Allowing or helping a family childcare provider to buy their own home and identify homes also that are in the communities that need to be rehabbed, right? And so these folks can buy a home that can be rehabbed, or buy the home that they're currently operating out of. And instead of paying lease, or in paying rent, they're paying a mortgage. And we have solved a couple of issues there. We have solved a home ownership issue. We've solved a wealth issue, because you talk about, wages versus wealth. And we know in this industry, many childcare providers are working at the lowest wage realm that exists for many industries. And so there's not many opportunities or pathways to create wealth. So you did mention the conversation, the idea of helping childcare providers own their own home and own a home in which they're also operating a business. So talk about, that policy, and if that's a policy that is, like has leg, is actually taking root in a community, in a state, someplace. Can you speak to that aspect of helping to resolve a childcare access issue as well as a home ownership issue?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, like I always appreciate when folks are able to acknowledge failures as shortcomings. So thank you for just being honest with that, Georgia. And I think you're right on thinking through how do we marry childcare with economic development, because I think the issues are intertwined. And I think it's a both and, not either or. But again, it's a question of how do we allocate resources differently in order to support this work? When I think about this from a federal perspective, and a lot of the new resources that are coming online largely through the Inflation Reduction Act and through the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, there are new dollars that are flowing into states and into communities in order to do home retrofits, largely for the purpose of energy efficiency, but it's an opportunity in order to rehab housing stock within communities. And it's a question of like, how can we do this in ways that different stakeholders can benefit beyond landlords? Because I know oftentimes there are a lot of absentee landlords in our smaller cities. And like, it's really thinking through what are the pathways to ownership for stakeholders as these new injections of federal funding are flowing into communities. So I think that's something to maybe think about. I think more specifically on this point around how to help providers who are renters and want to become owners, I think this is an opportunity to bring together philanthropy, to bring together impact investors, to think through are there particular investment vehicles or approaches that can help homeowners realize their dreams. I think one of the key challenges in this conversation, particularly when we're talking about childcare providers, is that care work is something that historically not only has it been underinvested in, it has been deemed unworthy of investment. This is often like unpaid work, particularly when we're talking about Black women in this space. And this is an issue that's personal for me because like when I was growing up, my mother was a childcare provider. Like she owned a little daycare, and like that's what she did in order to help raise my twin brother and my two sisters when my dad was a teacher in the Hartford Public Schools. And like, but at the same time, it's the dignity that comes with work and owning your own business that is like an intangible that oftentimes folks don't understand. But I think there's a key critical opportunity to have a different conversation with stakeholders around what would it take to support this population in new ways? What would it take to develop investment vehicles that prioritize and have an impact thesis that focuses on care? Again, it's like, how do we show up differently in order to do the work that is required for community transformation instead of, I think, maintaining what is a pretty benign status quo, because demonstrations aren't enough.
And it's interesting because I think it's not only how do we show up differently, but how you mentioned that having these types of conversations with providers. And I know because I have conversations every other week with our providers in Circle.
Yeah.
And I'm a part of advocacy group. And I think one of the things that we do to our detriment is that we focus oftentimes on the educational aspect of the early care and education. And we also
necessary and important.
It is necessary and important, but we oftentimes do that to the exclusion of looking at our work as an industry or even as a vehicle for creating inclusive economies, right? And I think it's not just about how we show up, but how do we also get people to think about us differently? Because it goes back again, one of the challenge for our industry is that there is not any dignity assigned to it. And so we're basically seen as glorified babysitters. Let's be clear. And so it's not just about how we have that mind shift, but how do we get folks who are in your space? And I'm not talking about you, Pierre, because I'm preaching to the choir with you, but a part of your work is to speak to the folks who aren't necessarily seeing things the way that we're seeing things. So how do we get those folks to also see the possibility and help them to shift also in as they're thinking about investments?
Yeah, I mean, I think 2 points. I think one, sometimes you have to preach to the choir so folks know exactly what to sing. But I think the broader point that I want to make, I mean, I have always been both lucky and privileged to be in positions where I can act as a translator between where it is communities want to go, their dreams, their aspirations, also their fears and the challenges, and where institutions largely sit in their comfort. And for me, whether it was working in government on two-generation approaches to reducing child poverty, or working at a small national foundation to support organizing groups that were grappling with this question around we can do tons of political advocacy, but if we're not able to build economic power and wealth for our communities, like what good is it to pass a piece of legislation that can change anytime at any time the political season changes? And it is this question around like how do we build durable community infrastructure that goes beyond a single issue. Like the issue today might be how do we work together in order to solve the child care crisis and also address housing. But it's building the networks and the relationships and the trust in order for folks to know, in order to like one, show up for each other, in order to know like I got you, even when like things get hot and like we're not always gonna agree. It's building those necessary relationships and that muscle, I've always found to be critical in order to do this work into the future. And I think one of the key challenges that I've both experienced and found uh, from my time in philanthropy is that oftentimes community-based organizations are pitted against each other because they're running after the same resource. And I think like this tends to be an issue of how place-based philanthropy sees itself. It's still largely a charity model,
Mhm.
which I get, and some of that work is important. But philanthropic funding is the funding that can show up when no other funding is ready,
Mhm.
because public dollars cannot show up until like all the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed, and like we know that the public isn't going to lose this money on this thing. Investment dollars aren't going to show up unless a project or initiative is able to pass a due diligence, which could take 8 months to a year, sometimes 2 years, depending on what the project is, trying to bring together all the different types of investment dollars. But philanthropy is that flexible dollar. And I think it is very critical and important for program officers and philanthropic CEOs who are in this space to think differently about their role. Their role needs to be a bridge builder in this work because your work, Georgia, the work of Circle and the providers that y'all work with, like your job is to educate kids and build businesses that work for those providers.
Mhm.
But there are other folks who have the luxury of time and also resources to be those bridge builders and to be those connectors and to invite groups like yours and other groups that are working on economic development, that are working on housing, into conversations around how do we all work together. And it's not just like conversations that end at you bring in a consultant and you have a vision, and that vision and has a mission statement, and like all that stuff is good, it feels good. But what folks really want and desire is like implementation dollars in order to do the work. And I think that is where largely local philanthropy needs to show up differently. Because if you're able to do that, then there are folks within national philanthropy who will come in. But if local communities aren't able to get their house in order and build those effective relationships, we're always going to be on this hamster wheel.
I want to take this opportunity, one, to shout out my state. because even though we're a family, Pierre, and with all families, we have our come to Jesus moment where we don't always see eye to eye. But I do want to shout out my state in the fact that we have created a community here. We have organized as providers, and our organization, ranges across different types of providers like center-based, family childcare, group home, youth camp, rural, urban, private, nonprofit. So I want to shout out my state because it is that type of building of trust and community that actually created the national Day Without Childcare movement. It resulted from the work that we did here in Connecticut. And it took us years to build that. But I also have to shout out Graustein, the William Graustein Memorial Fund, because you are so spot on that that is the role for philanthropy because of the flexibility. When we envisioned circles some 10 years ago, people didn't get it. Graustein got it. And Graustein gave us the funds when we were talking about early childhood apprenticeship. They were the only organization that understood how creating our early childhood apprenticeship can actually work to build about equity in education, creating inclusive economies, and so on and so forth, to the point now that the state of Connecticut has sent out an RFP after 10 years of us launching this work and launching this effort with funding primarily from Graustein. OEC, the Office of Early Child Education, now is putting out grant funding to encourage people to build and to develop apprenticeships. So we can talk about the success of that model where philanthropy can come in. The other area that we're looking for philanthropy to come in is to also going back to this non-traditional way of looking at investment. It's thinking about how philanthropy can come in and serve as a guarantor for some of these investment that we talk about, thinking about home ownership. We know that there's some limitation in state and federal funds in how the government can give folks money to purchase property. And so we're thinking that philanthropy can also be that space to help, because for many people of color, they don't have the necessary capital for the down payment or even the capital to pay a mortgage that has a 9% interest rate. But that can be a space for philanthropy to come in. How do you think we have conversations with philanthropic organization about thinking about their grant making in those different ways?
Yeah, so I think for me, again, putting my former funder hat on, I think that's awesome. The work that Graustein did working with you all on the apprenticeship program, like they're the first ones who got it. That's an example of investing in a demonstration, but you see the longer term arc of that work 10 years later, the transformation is the state putting in dollars in order to move this work at scale. On this question around how do we think about the role of philanthropy in this new model, I would argue that it cannot just be conversations with the program officers. If you have local philanthropy that has investment offices, I think it's also important to bring them into the conversation as well. Historically, there tends to be like firewalls between program and investment. But at the end of the day, like philanthropy is capital in order to deploy within place. And that can look like a grant. It can look like a guarantee. It could look like a program-related investment. It could look like a recoverable loan. And it's oftentimes like different funders have different comfort levels with what their risk tolerance is. And I think it would be great if there was an emerging conversation among funders around how they can show up differently, how they think about integrated capital, which means beyond grants, but also thinking through human capital, social capital, investment capital in ways that help communities realize their goals and objectives. Like that is just like the work of philanthropy as an industry. What I can say at the national level, there are many groups having these conversations, like justice funders, some of the state philanthropic support organizations are also having these conversations. Not sure if the Council of Foundations in Connecticut is doing this, but there are spaces where these conversations are happening. I think it would be neat if some of the early child care providers led a charge around, hey, there are other ways to think about grant making and investment philanthropy. Let's have a lunch conversation about this. Maybe bring in some speakers from national foundations who've done this well. The other way to approach this would be, and this is one of my former grantees and a good friend of mine, shout out to Transform Finance. They are a group based in New York City that does trainings with nonprofits all around the country, exposing them to the ways in which participatory community investing can work, where they've done these day-long trainings that bring together different stakeholders to understand their local investment ecosystem, to understand what community priorities might look like, and to create opportunities for alignment between community, investors, banks, in ways that, again, move some of these community priorities forward. And like these are some different ways that I would encourage folks to think about having a different conversation, not just around like how philanthropic program dollars show up, but also how do you align that with investment and also like projects that communities actually want to see invested in.
So speaking of creating those spaces for those broader conversations, there's an event happening on September 19th in Connecticut. And it's hosted by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. I know that you have been instrumental in planning this event. Can you talk to the audience and share with the audience this event and what you're hoping to achieve?
Yeah, so the Boston Fed and the New York Fed are co-hosting an event because we share Connecticut as a state. There's a cool history into like how that happened. I encourage folks to check it out. But we're doing an event on September 19th at Housatonic Community College. And the purpose behind this event is to really explore promising practices and emerging approaches to support childcare facilities, because I think this isn't a problem of like you can't train your way out of this issue. Like unless folks have space, commercial space in home-based care settings, we're not going to be able to address the childcare crisis. And this is an opportunity to bring together providers, to bring together banks, to bring together philanthropy, to bring together investors, to have like a series of conversations, like one focused on like the perspective of providers and what they're dealing with in real time as they're looking to support children and families, to have conversations at the state level with CDFIs and other players who have developed important financing tools that are critical to advancing pathways for facilities. And then in the afternoon, we're looking to have a conversation to really explore what is the learning edge and the new frontier around new models, real estate investment trusts, and other ways to bring in new capital into places who, again, have historically been denied investment in order to move this issue forward in ways that improve material condition and build wealth for places and communities and workers. And I think it's just going to be a really exciting opportunity to bring together some of these stakeholders for a very different conversation, hoping that folks can make it.
So, Pierre, I would be a person that would say, in listening to this, was like, but, this is childcare. What does the Federal Reserve Banks have to do with childcare? So can you speak to why the Federal Reserve Banks of New York or Boston is interested in this work?
Yeah, so speaking from my perspective at the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, like we have a primary focus and interest of supporting low-income communities in smaller cities and rural areas. That has been our place-based work over the 10 years. It aligns with the dual mandate of the Federal Reserve, which is price stability and maximum employment. And childcare is a key critical barrier to realizing full employment. And if we can, through our convening power and through our research and partnerships and working with stakeholders on the ground, bring together folks who historically don't talk to each other about this stuff in new ways, that is a win. And we're excited to have opportunities to have a very different type of conversation around how we move this issue forward in ways that can hopefully get investment to communities and providers that need it.
So we are privileged to be one of the invited guests at this event on September 19th. And we encourage all of the folks that are listening to make sure that they register. And do you have a website that they can go to register for the event?
Yeah, I believe the New York Fed has a website up where folks can register. If you click on events on newyorkfed.org, you should be able to see September 19th, promising approaches to childcare facilities.
Okay, and so again, as I said, we are really very blessed to be invited. Thank you for inviting us to speak about some of the work that we're doing here and to present some of the ideas around these non-traditional ways that we can finance childcare facilities. Can you talk about some of the other presenters that are going to be there?
Yeah, we're going to have a range of players. Mission Driven Finance, who's created this childcare real estate investment trust that is doing the work in order to help expand access to home-based childcare in a key number of states. JP Morgan is going to share around some of the work that they've done in the new markets tax credit space in order to support childcare facilities. LISC Connecticut is going to be showing up to share some of their programs and how they've really helped support and expand facilities within the state of Connecticut. IFF, a group out of a national CDFI, is going to be sharing some of the work that they're doing. This is really just an opportunity, yet again, to bring together stakeholders who usually don't talk to each other into the space to have the critical conversation around how do we help address this facilities challenge and hopefully expand childcare in Connecticut and beyond.
You know, one of the things we talked about for Circle is that it's important to transform the spaces where children live and where they learn. And, you know, going back again to the facility, you know, we can't out educate ourselves, you know, out of this. And it is important to make sure that children have, you know, not just beautiful facilities, but facilities that actually serve them. And when I think about that, I think about New Haven and Connecticut. And again, you know, I'm a critic when I need to be, but there are some really wonderful things that Connecticut is doing. And I know that they have set aside some funding around, you know, building and creating facilities through the community investment funds. And there was an article in the paper today about funding that the legislators have also allocated to address pockets of poverties in communities. So there are lots of different opportunities in Connecticut, and I am so grateful, you know, that we do live in a state, you know, where we can challenge our legislators to think differently and challenge some of our philanthropists to also think differently. And I want to speak to, you know, I feel really proud of the work that we do here. But can you speak to some of the other types of successful models that you're seeing in other states as we get ready to wrap up?
Yeah, I mean, there's the jury is still out on this, but I think looking at some of the work in Vermont with their Let's Grow Kids legislation that has, I think, expanded opportunities for home-based childcare through an increase in the subsidy for providers is critical and something that folks should be exploring. They're going to be one of the partners in the event on the 19th, so I hope folks will tune in for that. When I think about other models, I'm seeing a lot of interest. This is really coming from community stakeholders in neighborhood cooperative-based childcare.
Mhm.
This is just like residents getting together, like in that same spirit of Ruby Duncan and Operation Life, like we can do this and we can do this better. Folks are beginning to think through like how can we perhaps purchase a few homes and operate our own daycares? Because like what folks also want is childcare from folks that they trust.
Yeah.
And like that relationship building is critical. And I think that's something that we're seeing a lot of interest in around New England states, and we're finding ways to work with folks in order to explore how to do more of that.
Mhm. And that is a part of, I think it's so important because when any survey that's been taken of parents, the number one issue that always comes up is safety, and that is rooted and trust of the provider. And this is why I think for us it's so important. Not that we want to continue to have racialized settings for children. I think it's important for children to be integrated in different types of setting, but recognizing as well that when families are making these choices about who to care for their children, it's as important to see those folks who are caring for them look like them or even have the same language. And you mentioned that multi-generational approach to the care work. And I think also in creating spaces for people from the community who are retired and, who can come in and be that grandmother to that child or be the grandmother to that parent, because you have so many parents in New Haven that are also refugees that are coming from different countries that are cut off from their extended family. So I think that work is so important. So Pierre, we're getting close to that time of wrapping up. Are there any final thoughts that you would like to leave us with as we come to the end of our conversation?
Yeah, I think for me, like at the end of the day, this work begins and ends with community, and it is critical that we resource and build this social infrastructure in new ways to begin seeing the interconnectedness of our issues, whether it's childcare, whether it's housing, whether it's economic development. These are the critical building blocks of investment, and unless and until we're all working together, we're not going to achieve transformation. And transformation has to be the goal in this work. We have to move beyond demonstrations.
And I so agree. And this is why I always love talking to you, Pierre. I feel like I'm 5'2". I feel like I grow a foot every time I.
Thanks for having me.
I'm so grateful. And I look forward to having a continued conversation and working with the Boston Federal Reserve on this work. I think it's very critical work. It is crucial and fundamental to the work that Circle is doing here. And look forward to chopping it up again on September 19th with the rest of the folks.
Absolutely.
All right.
Thank you, Georgia.
Once again, I would just like to say thank you to Tom Ficklin for giving us this platform, and just thank everyone who spent their hour with us listening to this conversation. Have a good
As I got another rhyme, another rhythm for y'all to listen. I'm never quitting on my mission. I'ma roll with what I'm giving. Got some ambition, this new edition, filling positions. Looking at the void in myself and feeling what's missing. Better watch the way you going, better go in the right direction. In the moment you stressing, but you gon' be counting blessings. And I know that for certain. Keep on working, open curtains. Haters swerving, cause they ain't ready for your final version. Whoa. I'm never gonna give up. Fall down, I just gotta get up, yeah. Cause this is my road. Let's camera action.
You're listening to the Tom Ficklin Show on WNHHLP 103.5 FM, your home